Oakland, 1951. A 6-year-old boy heads to a neighborhood park with his older brother and simply never comes back. One moment he's running toward the swings. The next, he's gone. The screen drops to black. A narrator's voice breaks through the silence as faded family photographs slowly appear. Birthdays, school portraits, tiny moments that now feel unbearably heavy. For 73 years, his family refuses to give up. Search teams, newspaper ads, interviews, dead ends, decade after decade. Then, nearly 3/4 of a century later, a routine DNA test delivers a result no one could prepare for. The child they lost is somehow alive. Music rises as an elderly man steps forward, shaking, and falls into the arms of the family that spent a lifetime mourning him. This is the extraordinary story of a little boy taken in daylight, a life rebuilt under another name, and a truth that only time and science could uncover. How did a mystery this old finally break open? Stay with us as we trace every step of a cold case that defies logic. A story proving that reality can be far stranger than anything imagined. Welcome to True Crime Faculty. If you love deep, riveting investigations and unbelievable real-world revelations, please hit like, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Now, let's get into today's case. The metal chains of the swings rattled in the wind, a thin, uneven sound that barely registered as Roger stood rooted to the spot. Kids raced across the sand behind him, their voices sharp and bright, but none of it landed. His eyes were fixed on the park gate, on the empty strip of sidewalk where, only minutes earlier, he'd watched a woman in a green bandana walk away with his 6-year-old brother. He didn't remember sitting on the swing. He didn't remember his hands going still. He only knew his legs felt too heavy to move and too light to hold him at the same time. The candy wrapper Luis had dropped near his shoe fluttered against the dirt, catching the afternoon sun like a tiny, misplaced flag. Luis had smiled at the woman. That kept flashing in Roger's mind, a looping image he couldn't shut off. He remembered the way she crouched low to meet his brother's eyes, speaking softly, a tone that made Luis tilt his head before placing his hand in hers. She'd spoken in Spanish. Not perfect, not fluent, but enough. Enough to make a little boy believe she belonged. 10 minutes. Maybe less. Maybe more. Time had stretched and narrowed in ways Roger couldn't measure. He finally pushed his feet off the ground and stumbled forward. His breath came thin. His hands trembled. He followed the trail toward the sidewalk as if expecting Luis to be hiding behind the hedges or crouching under a bench. But there was nothing. Only the dust, the sun, and the outline of the city bus that drove by without slowing. Something snapped behind him. Glass. A door? Roger. The sound cut the air open. He turned just as his mother, Antonia, sprinted across the grass in her flour-dusted apron. She must have run straight from the kitchen. The fabric was still wet in places from rinsing vegetables. Her eyes were frantic, searching every corner of the park before they landed on him. Where is he? She grabbed his shoulders, too hard, too fast. Where is your brother? Roger opened his mouth, but the words jammed in his throat. He managed only a thin, broken breath. Antonia spun toward a cluster of children. Did anyone see him? Did he run this way? Her voice cracked. A little girl pointed toward the street, but shrugged, unsure. A screen door slammed from across the road. Then another. Neighbors emerged onto porches, shading their eyes. A woman called out, asking what happened. Someone else mentioned seeing 2 boys walking earlier. A man stepped off his front step and crossed the street, concern tightening his voice. What's wrong? What's going on? My son, Antonia said. My little boy, he was just here. Roger stared at the patch of sidewalk again. His stomach twisted. He felt weightless and crushed at the same time. The woman in the green bandana had walked briskly, her grip firm around Luis's hand. She'd laughed at something he said. Her shoes made soft tapping sounds against the pavement. Roger had followed them halfway toward the exit before doubt crept in. Something about her pace. Something about the way she kept checking behind them. When she turned the corner, he'd taken a single step after them, then stopped. He was scared she'd look back. He was even more scared of being wrong. He whispered, "Mommy." Antonia turned, eyes wide. "Tell me, did he say where he was going?" Roger shook his head. His vision blurred. A police cruiser rolled down the street, slowing at the curb. The officer stepped out, adjusting his belt. He scanned the gathering crowd before approaching with a steady stride. "Someone called about a missing child?" Antonia nodded quickly. My son. 6 years old. He was here. He was just here. The officer glanced at Roger. You were with him? Roger nodded. What happened? He swallowed hard and tried to explain. The woman. The bandana. The candy. His voice wavered, dropping to a whisper. She said she would buy him something. And she talked like us. The officer's expression tightened. What direction did they go? Roger pointed down the sidewalk. The officer followed the line of his arm, then radioed for backup. Another cruiser pulled up, then another. Questions came fast. How tall was she? What color hair? Did she say her name? Did she seem familiar? Did she touch you? Did she seem like family? Roger's answers faded as he shook his head again and again. His throat burned. He felt himself shrinking under the attention, shrinking under the truth he didn't want to say aloud. Antonia paced in a frantic circle, calling Luis's name. Each repetition grew quieter, like she was losing breath or hope with every shout. A pair of officers walked the perimeter of the park. Another flagged down a passing driver. Someone crouched near the gate, examining the ground for footprints. A neighbor brought Antonia a glass of water she didn't drink. A group of children stared from the slide, their game forgotten. The sun dipped lower, casting long strips of shadow across the grass. Through it all, Roger stayed still. His mind replayed the moment the woman held out the candy. He saw Luis glance at him first, just a quick look, checking if it was okay. He remembered hesitating, unsure whether to nod or tell him no. He remembered thinking she seemed friendly. He remembered thinking nothing bad would happen in the middle of the afternoon. He remembered being wrong. The officer who'd first arrived returned and knelt in front of him. He rested one hand on his own knee, lowering himself to Roger's eye level. You said she spoke your language, right? Roger's breath caught. The sounds of the park dimmed to a faint hum. Even the children's laughter from across the yard seemed distant, like it belonged to another world entirely. He didn't answer immediately. He couldn't, because the truth, the one forming in his chest, felt sharp. He wasn't sure anymore. Maybe she did. Maybe she only said a phrase or two that sounded familiar. Maybe he wanted to believe she was safe because she seemed warm and kind and patient enough to listen. The officer's voice softened. Son, I need you to think carefully. Roger's eyes drifted back to the sidewalk. The breeze nudged the abandoned candy wrapper again, flipping it over in the dust. He swallowed, heart hammering. Was he certain? Or had fear already blurred the edges? He opened his mouth and froze. Whatever he said next would decide how the search began. Whatever he said next would shape everything that came after. The officer waited. Roger lowered his gaze. And the words he was about to speak would change the course of 73 years. The officer's question hung in the air longer than it should have. Roger swallowed, eyes fixed on the stretch of sidewalk where the woman and Luis had walked away. He remembered the way she bent slightly to speak to them, the way her words felt familiar. He nodded, barely audible. She did, he whispered. She spoke like us. The officers exchanged glances, quick, brief, uncertain. Something in their posture shifted. Antonia didn't notice. She was still scanning the park as if her son might appear between the swings and the sandbox if she searched hard enough. The minutes after that blurred. A patrol car rolled closer. A second officer approached. One wrote notes. Another tried to calm Antonia. None of them raised their voice. It was the quiet that made it worse. The type that fills a room before the truth arrives. A flashlight beam moved across the slide. Another swept under the benches. Roger watched it all as if he stood outside himself. Every few seconds, he turned toward the street, hoping to catch sight of the green bandana again. Nothing. Just the faint whistle of wind passing through the trees. By the time the sun lowered, the neighborhood had shifted into motion. Doors opened. Voices murmured. Children were pulled inside. Grown-ups gathered near the park fence, asking questions, offering names, pointing down sidewalks. Someone brought water to Antonia. Someone else held her shoulders when her knees weakened. She took him. She took my boy, she kept saying. Her apron was still dusted with flour. The officers began widening the search. They moved down Brush Street, knocking on doors. Others scanned the alleyways running behind the old clapboard houses. One officer carried a photograph. Not a recent one, just a school picture with Luis smiling shyly, hair combed unevenly. Roger followed a few steps behind Antonia everywhere she went. He couldn't bring himself to speak unless she asked him to. When the officers asked him to repeat what happened, his throat tightened. He forced the details out, each word heavier than the last. She talked to us. She said she'd get him candy. You didn't follow them? I tried. But I ran to tell my mom. Every time he said it, he felt his chest tighten, as if he had chosen the wrong thing. When darkness settled over the neighborhood, the search took on a different shape. Lanterns appeared. Neighbors held them high as they walked through backyards and vacant lots. Officers combed through brush with long poles, moving slowly, calling Luis's name. Down by the docks, Coast Guard boats drifted through the water, their lights softly glowing across the bay. The sound of their engines hummed against the shoreline. Officers along the pier knelt to shine lights between pilings, eyes scanning the ripples below. Antonia stood near the railing with her arms wrapped around herself. The air smelled of salt and diesel. Roger stayed close behind her, gripping the back of her apron like a lifeline. Every wave that slapped against the wood made his stomach twist. One officer approached Antonia gently. "It's only a precaution," he said. "We check everywhere." Land and water. She didn't answer. Her eyes followed the searchlights moving across the bay, waiting for something, anything, to surface. Back home, hours later, the house felt smaller. Family members filled the living room, their voices soft and overlapping. A framed picture of Luis sat on the table, candlelight flickering beside it. Spanish prayers blended with whispered English ones. Some prayed for strength. Others prayed for a miracle. Roger sat on the couch, arms wrapped around his knees. He stared at the pattern in the rug. Every so often, he heard Luis's laugh, not in the room, but in memory, echoing faintly like something lost behind a closed door. His mother paced by the windows, her hands trembling slightly. She lifted the curtain, stared outside, lowered it, and repeated the motion. No one told her to rest. She wouldn't have listened anyway. A knock came at the door close to midnight. 2 officers entered, hats in hand. "We're still looking," one said. "We'll check again at first light." Antonia's voice was barely audible. "You think he fell in the water?" The officers paused. Their silence answered before their words did. "It's one possibility," the older officer replied quietly. "But we're not stopping." Roger felt something in him tighten. He knew Luis didn't run toward the bay. He knew his brother didn't wander off alone. But hearing grown men doubt him pressed a weight on his chest so heavy he could barely breathe. Morning came without rest. Antonia was already dressed, eyes red, hair pulled back tightly. She marched toward the station before anyone else woke, Roger following close behind. The station lobby smelled faintly of old coffee. A radio murmured from a back room. Officers hurried past them, papers in hand. Antonia stood at the counter, refusing to sit. "Tell me," she said. "What did you find?" The officer behind the desk hesitated. "Nothing yet, but crews are still searching." Roger climbed onto the bench outside the office door. He could hear fragments of conversation inside. Words like missing, uncertain, possible, and accident. The kind of words adults use when they don't want to say what they really think. He pressed his palms to his eyes. For a moment, he imagined Luis standing near the playground again, smiling, waving at him to come push the swing. The image shattered when he overheard a voice behind the door say quietly, "These cases rarely end well." The words cut through him like a cold draft. By sunset, most leads had faded. Witnesses remembered seeing a woman walking, but none could describe her face. Some said she had a purse. Others said she didn't. No one remembered her stepping into a car. She simply vanished into the neighborhood. Antonia refused to leave the station until someone made a promise, a real one. "You keep looking. You don't stop just because it's dark." "We won't," the sergeant said. "Go home for tonight." She didn't move. "Ma'am," he added softly, "we're on it. Please rest." At last, she allowed Roger to guide her toward the exit, though she looked back twice, as if Luis might walk through the doors behind her. Just as they reached the lobby, a phone began ringing in the back office. The sound was sharp, insistent. The officer nearest to it answered, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly as he listened. He turned toward Antonia. "Mrs. Albino, this call might be about your son." The officer's unreadable expression leaves Antonia suspended between hope and dread. The phone call from the station turned out to be nothing more than a clerk misreading a note on his desk. No new witness. No sighting. No answer. By the next morning, the case file lay open on a metal desk already gathering dust around the edges. The officer who had questioned Roger the first night told Antonia they would keep looking, but his eyes said something else. Something Roger noticed even at 10. The real search began, and then slowly, over months, became something quieter. Antonia kept returning to the station. At first, she came every morning, apron still tied at her waist, hair pinned back in haste. She spoke through neighbors who walked with her and helped translate. The same request every time. Have you heard anything? Please. Anything. The officers started greeting her by name. They no longer asked her to sit. They no longer opened the file. They simply told her there was nothing new. They were polite, but the words lacked weight. Roger watched this unfold with a feeling he didn't yet have a name for. Only the sense that the adults around his mother had stopped believing in something she refused to let go. Eventually, her visits shifted. Every day turned into every few days. Then once a week. Then once a month. But she always showed up. On telephone poles around Brush Street, the posters began to curl at the corners. Rain faded the ink until Luis's eyes looked washed out and distant. Antonia replaced them when she could, smoothing each one with her palm, as if the image could somehow feel her touch. At home, she kept a newspaper clipping folded neatly in her apron pocket, the one with Luis's school photo printed too dark and the headline misspelled. She never corrected the mistake. She only held the paper until the edges softened and the crease wore white. Roger grew from a small boy glued to her side into a teenager tall enough to keep pace with her as they walked. Every trip to the station, every whispered conversation, every quiet night where she cried into a dish towel, he saw all of it. And each moment carved something permanent inside him. The family learned English out of necessity, not from books, from surviving. Roger helped translate forms for his parents, helped explain questions from officers, helped read letters sent from Puerto Rico. He would sit at the kitchen table long after the others slept, turning the words carefully in his mind, wanting to be perfect so he wouldn't miss anything important. Because what if the one clue, the one detail that mattered, was hidden in a sentence he misunderstood? Guilt became a shadow that followed him everywhere. If he'd stayed with Luis, if he hadn't run, if he'd grabbed his brother's hand instead of leaving to get their mother. Sometimes he saw Luis in the corner of his eye. A flicker of memory, a sound, a laugh. But when he turned, it was only the quiet house or one of his sisters brushing past. By 1960, the world around them had changed. New stores replaced old ones. Streets filled with families who didn't know the Albino's history. But inside their home, Luis's absence remained an open wound. When talk of draft lists and enlistment letters spread across the neighborhood, something in Antonia shifted. Luis would have been nearing the age for military paperwork. She didn't say it out loud, but Roger understood what she was hoping. Maybe the government had his name. Maybe someone had registered him. Maybe he had grown into a young man somewhere far away. The family checked records. They visited offices. They wrote letters in both languages. Each time they were told the same thing. No match. Still, Antonia kept trying. Some relatives in Puerto Rico told stories, tiny threads of possibility, of a boy someone saw who looked remarkably like him. A tilt of the head, a familiar smile, a resemblance. Each rumor was enough for Antonia to buy tickets she couldn't afford. They made the trip more than once. Each visit ended the same way, quiet disappointment wrapped in polite farewells. But on the flight home, she always held Roger's hand tighter than usual, as if reminding herself she hadn't lost them all. Every Sunday, Antonia lit a candle near the window. She whispered prayers in Spanish, asking for strength, for protection, for a sign. Sometimes she prayed for forgiveness, though no one knew why. Roger suspected she blamed herself for letting them go to the park, but she never said it aloud. Years passed like pages turning. Birthdays. Holidays. Roger graduated. His sisters married. New children filled the house during gatherings. But one chair was always left untouched, the chair where Luis had last sat with a bowl of plantains he hadn't finished. No one moved it. No one used it. It became a quiet monument. The winter of 1966 brought rainstorms that soaked the porch until the wood swelled. On one of those days, a small envelope arrived with no return address. The handwriting leaned sharply to the right, written by someone in a hurry. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A message. I think I saw a boy in San Jose who looks just like your missing son. The writing trembled near the bottom of the page. The next line began with, I didn't know who to tell but. And then it stopped. Mid-sentence. Ink trailing off as if the pen had been pulled away abruptly. Roger read it twice, heart pounding. Antonia held the page to her chest, whispering Luis's name under her breath. The storm outside pressed hard against the windows, rattling the glass. What would you do if this letter landed in your mailbox? Tell me in the comments. And tap subscribe so you don't miss what this family discovers next. As the family debated what to do next, a second envelope slid under the door. This one wet from the rain, edges already tearing. Inside was no message. Only a photograph. A boy standing near a storefront, face turned just enough that it could have been anyone. Or it could have been Luis. Roger stared at the image, pulse rising, unsure if hope was lifting him or breaking him. And then Antonia asked, her voice barely audible, "Is that him?" Roger opened his mouth. And the chapter ends on the moment before he answers. The story bends away from Oakland now, carried across years Luis never knew were stolen from him. What happened after he stepped off the park path is something the family only learned decades later, pieced together through fragments, small truths inside larger silences. A child sits on a plain seat too big for him, legs dangling above the floor. He doesn't cry. He doesn't speak. He only watches the clouds drift past the oval window as the woman beside him keeps her hand tight around his wrist. The hum of the engines masks every question that bubbles inside him. He presses his forehead to the cold glass. Somewhere far behind him, a mother is calling his name through a park growing dark. On the East Coast, he enters a house that smells nothing like home. A man with heavy steps closes the door behind them, nods once, and carries a small suitcase to a room waiting with unfamiliar toys. The woman guides him inside, places a hand on his shoulder, and whispers a name he's never heard before. She repeats it until he answers to it. His tiny voice echoes back to her with a careful obedience. School papers begin to carry the new name. He writes it slowly, the letters uncertain, as if he's borrowing someone else's identity one line at a time. Teachers smile at him. Neighbors wave. His world rewrites itself in routines he never chose. He grows into the role the household demands. Quiet, polite, watchful. A child who blends into rooms rather than taking space within them. Photos in the living room show holidays and birthdays. He stands in each one, but never at the center. He leans slightly toward the edges, as if instinctively aware he doesn't entirely belong. As he reaches his teenage years, time sharpens him. His posture straightens. His steps become measured. He moves with the discipline of someone who learned early that silence is safer than questions. He carries himself like a boy who has already experienced more displacement than he can articulate. Recruiters visit his high school. Uniforms, stories, travel, a life built on order and purpose. Something in him responds to the idea of structure, of clarity, even if he doesn't completely understand why. When he enlists, the woman who raised him stands in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed. Her expression is unreadable. The man gives a curt nod, saying only, "It's your choice now." He boards another plane, older but carrying the same quiet expression he had as a child. Boots on metal flooring, duffel at his feet, he blends among other recruits, young men hungry for meaning. He doesn't speak much, but people trust his steadiness. He becomes the one who listens first, acts second, and never hesitates once he commits. Vietnam changes his silhouette. When he returns from his first tour, his shoulders have broadened, and there's a stillness in his gaze that wasn't there before. He steps off the bus alone, duffel slung over his back, walking toward a city that doesn't recognize the boy he once was. He doesn't recognize him either. He studies his reflection in shop windows, as if searching for traces of a childhood he can't retrieve. Years later, he trades the uniform for turnout gear. Firehouse mornings become predictable, coffee brewing, radios crackling, the quiet before the call. He moves with purpose through drills, memorizing every step until it becomes instinct. Sirens reflect off the windows as they roar through streets he's learned by heart. Inside burning buildings, he trusts the rhythm of training more than memory. Action becomes a language he speaks fluently. He is known for stepping forward even when heat curls up stairwells or smoke closes around him. Others say he's fearless. He never claims that. Inside each call, there is a moment, brief, subtle, where something inside him stirs, like a memory he cannot grasp. A sensation of being carried away, moving towards something he doesn't fully understand. He builds a family. A small home on a quiet street. A partner who laughs easily and worries when he works night shifts. Neighbors know him as steady, polite, protective. The type of man who always helps carry groceries or checks on the elderly couple next door after a storm. His life grows roots, steady ones. but beneath them lies a question that surfaces in quiet moments. Sometimes he lingers over old photographs, not the ones from his childhood, but the ones he took himself. The firehouse, holidays, those he loves. He studies his own face, searching for familiarity in his own features. Something is always missing. In the firehouse locker, he keeps a small tin. Inside are scraps collected over the years, a postcard, a button, a folded pamphlet. None of them answer anything, yet he keeps them as if they anchor him to some invisible thread stretching backward through time. His children grow. They inherit pieces of him, the steadiness, the quiet strength, the careful way he listens. Moments of comfort fill the house. Laughter at the dinner table, a hand steadying a toddler down the steps, late-night conversations in soft lamplight. But even in those moments, something inside him feels slightly out of alignment, like a melody missing a note. Then comes the hospital room. A light burns softly overhead. Machines beep in slow, steady intervals. He holds his newborn child, swaddled and breathing gently against his chest. The world narrows to the warmth of the infant's small body and the weight of the moment. He studies the tiny face. A rush of tenderness fills him, along with a sudden, hollow ache. He runs a thumb across the newborn's cheek and whispers, barely audible, "I don't know where I come from." The words linger in the quiet room, settling into the space around him. A lifelong question with no answer, suspended in the air like a truth waiting to surface. The question remains, echoing into the years ahead, a question that will one day collide with the past he never knew he had. The years folded into one another, soft at the edges yet heavy in the middle, the kind of weight a family learns to carry without speaking of it. By the early 1990s, the Albino home had settled into a rhythm that never felt complete. Photos of children and grandchildren filled the hallway, but one frame near the kitchen stayed unchanged. Luis at 6, smiling wide, his shirt a little crooked at the collar. Roger, now in his 40s, kept a quiet tradition. Every February, he stopped his car near the old park on Brush Street. He never stayed long. He'd step out, hands in his pockets, looking toward the sidewalk where the woman in the green bandana once walked away with his little brother. The park had changed, fresh paint on the swings, a newer fence around the grass, but the memory hadn't. He stood there until the air chilled him back to the present, then returned to the life he'd built around an empty space. Antonia was slowing down by then. Her walk had softened, and she held railings more often. Still, she made her visits to the police station. Not daily, not weekly, but whenever her strength allowed. The officers had changed many times since 1951. Younger faces, different uniforms, new procedures. But each one recognized her the moment she approached the desk. They never grew impatient. Something about her presence quieted the room. "Any word?" she would ask. Some officers checked the system out of courtesy, though they knew nothing new would appear. Others simply shook their heads gently. She always nodded, thanked them, and stepped back out into the light, clutching her small purse, where the same newspaper clipping stayed folded and worn. Home was harder for her. She kept Luis's baby clothes in a small box under her bed. Sometimes, early in the morning, she folded them again, tiny shirts smoothed flat with careful hands. No one asked why she did it. The family learned long ago that grief has its own rituals. Roger watched her closely during these years. He often drove her to the market or appointments, noticing the strain in her steps. On those drives, she would sometimes look out the window and say quietly, he would be grown by now. Roger always responded with a nod. Anything more felt too fragile to touch. At night, when the house was still, Roger allowed himself moments he never let the others see. Sitting in his car parked outside his home, he would rest his forehead against the steering wheel. No tears at first, just long, steady breaths that trembled as he exhaled. Eventually, the weight he carried for decades pressed too deeply to swallow. The memories returned in pieces. Luis's laughter, the way he tugged on Roger's sleeve, the moment he let go of his hand. The guilt lived in him like a second heartbeat. Family gatherings during these years always held a pause, a quiet shift in mood, whenever someone mentioned Luis. It wasn't the kind of silence that settled awkwardly. It was an old silence, familiar and understood. Someone would say, he'd be about this age now, and everyone would glance toward the photo on the wall before returning to their plates. The grandchildren grew up knowing his name before understanding the loss behind it. They asked gentle questions, and the adults answered with careful words. "Your Uncle Luis is missing," they would say. "We're still hoping." Hope had aged, but it hadn't vanished. By the early 2000s, Antonia's movements slowed even further. Her hands shook when she poured tea. She sat more often near the window, watching the street with a softness in her eyes, as if expecting a familiar small figure to appear at the gate. Her children worried but didn't press her. They knew the past kept her company in ways they never could. In 2005, on a quiet morning, she didn't come out of her room. The light through her window cast a warm glow over her, as if trying to hold her there a little longer. She looked peaceful. The family filled the house by afternoon, voices breaking as they remembered everything she'd carried. Her funeral gathered neighbors, old friends, and people from the community who had watched her endure decades with quiet strength. The church filled with soft hymns, and every mention of her son's name tightened the air. After the burial, when most people had left, Roger stayed behind in her room. The bed was neatly made, her rosary resting on the nightstand. While sorting her belongings, he opened a wooden prayer box he'd never seen before. Inside were slips of paper, some yellowed, some newer, each noting a date. Her handwriting was careful but faint. "Visit to station," one read. "Asked again today," wrote another. The dates stretched over 5 decades. At the bottom of the stack lay one final note, written shakier than the rest, but still unmistakably hers. "I know he's alive." Roger sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling in his hand. He'd heard her say those words before, always in prayer or quiet conviction. But seeing them written, held onto so firmly, so close to her final days, shifted something inside him. It felt less like a hope and more like a message she meant to leave behind. He looked around the room, the stillness heavy yet familiar, then back at the note. The simple sentence lingered there, almost glowing under the afternoon light, pressing into his thoughts with new force. Roger realized this wasn't just faith, it was something she believed to her final breath. And he couldn't shake the feeling that she'd written it for a reason he had yet to understand. Alida hadn't planned on becoming part of a mystery older than she was. In the middle of lockdown, the world felt small, pressed in by silence and the hum of uncertainty. People baked bread, learned new hobbies, and ordered small boxes in the mail promising to reveal their ancestry. She ordered one out of boredom more than curiosity, a tiny plastic tube that asked for a minute of her life and a stamp. She mailed it without ceremony and forgot about it for weeks. The results arrived on a quiet afternoon in June 2020. She opened her laptop with a cup of coffee in hand, expecting nothing more than a map with colored regions and percentages. Instead, at the top of the page, a notification read, "Close family match, 22% shared DNA." She blinked, leaned closer. The number didn't make sense. It wasn't distant. It wasn't vague. It sat firmly in the space reserved for people you should know. An uncle, a half-brother, someone old enough to have been woven into family stories. A gray-toned profile picture accompanied the match. An older man, 70s maybe, standing outside what looked like a house with winter shrubs in the background. His eyes held something she couldn't quite read, a quiet steadiness, almost familiar. She whispered to herself, "Who are you?" She clicked the match details. The page outlined possible relationships. Uncle, great-uncle, or even a grandparental connection. She scrolled again. There was nothing else. No biography. No hint. A name, a face, and a percentage. Her pulse picked up. It wasn't fear, more like a tug. A thread pulling her towards something she hadn't expected. She messaged him. "Hello, I believe we're a DNA match. I'd love to know more about our connection." She read it 3 times before pressing send. The message hovered under the bubble marked unread, and for the rest of the day, she refreshed the page every hour. By midnight, it was still unread. She told herself he might be busy, or older and less comfortable with technology. Or maybe he didn't recognize the importance of DNA notifications. She closed the laptop and exhaled. Days passed, then weeks. Her message remained untouched, the small gray circle frozen in place. Eventually she stopped checking. Life pressed in again. Work, family, the slow reopening of the world. She stored the strange connection in a quiet corner of her mind, like a book left half-read on a shelf. But she never forgot the picture, the winter shrubs, the lined face, the eyes she couldn't shake. Every now and then, she wondered if she was imagining the likeness. A tilt of the head similar to her Uncle Roger. a line near the brow that reminded her of old photos of her grandmother. She brushed the thought aside each time. DNA could be messy, she told herself. Matches sometimes overstated connections. Still, the number, 22%, stayed with her. Months slipped into a year. The world reopened. Holidays came and went. The small match on her ancestry profile receded into the background of her digital life. Something she'd get back to someday. Something she planned to revisit when she had the emotional bandwidth. And then 4 years passed. It happened on an ordinary morning in March 2024. Alita was waiting in line at a pharmacy, scrolling through her phone while people shuffled ahead. A familiar blue icon appeared near the top of her notifications. You have new DNA activity. She paused. Another line appeared below it. One of your close matches has updated their profile. Her thumb hovered. She tapped. The app opened with a slow loading wheel. When the page finally cleared, the name at the top was the same. The gray-toned profile picture of the older man stared back at her, unchanged except for one small detail. A green dot next to his name. Online. For the first time in 4 years, the connection was active. Her breath locked for a moment. The pharmacy aisle felt distant, sounds fading as she focused on the screen. She pressed the message thread. Her old message waited there, unread, untouched. But beneath it was a new line. Match strength updated, strong. That tug she'd felt years earlier returned, sharper this time. It felt less like curiosity and more like a door cracking open, letting in air from a room she hadn't known existed. She didn't send another message. Not yet. Instead, she screenshotted the match, the updated percentage, the active status light. She stepped out of the pharmacy line and walked toward the exit, her heart pacing itself unevenly. Outside, she leaned against her car, fingers wrapped around her phone. Why now? Why after all this time? The green dot glowed steadily. Inside that tiny icon was a man who shared nearly a quarter of her DNA. A man no one in her family had ever mentioned. A man who looked old enough to be something significant. The screen refreshed automatically. A new flicker of text appeared beneath his name. Last active, moments ago. She stared at it, a quiet certainty forming in her chest. One that felt both foreign and strangely inevitable. This wasn't random. This wasn't a glitch. Something was shifting, and it was pointing directly toward a question her family had buried for decades. The screen lights up again, new match activity available, and Alita feels, for the first time, that she might be standing at the edge of the truth. The library was almost empty when Alita pushed through the glass doors with her daughters beside her. Afternoon light pooled across the carpet, soft and hazy, catching dust in slow drift. It was the kind of quiet that made every movement feel louder than it was. She walked straight toward the research desk, her mask still hanging from one ear out of habit, and asked for access to the old Oakland Tribune archives. Her daughters waited near a table, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and patience. They had heard pieces of the family story since they were children. The brother who vanished, the mother who prayed for decades, but it had always sounded like something belonging to another lifetime, not theirs. When the librarian returned with the small metal drawer of microfilm rolls, Alita carried it to the viewing station. She sat down, fed the first roll into place, and began to scroll. At first, the images flickered by in steady rhythm. Grocery ads, school events, charity drives, headlines about the waterfront. She kept scrolling. Her daughters leaned in close, helping her scan each frame for anything familiar. They found nothing. She switched roles. More scrolling. More faces. More stories from a world that no longer existed. Then she slowed down. A photo jumped out of the blur without warning. 2 boys in a park, sand clinging to their elbows as they dug into a small plastic bucket. One was older, leaning protectively over the smaller child. Both were smiling. Alita leaned closer. Her heart caught in her chest when she saw the caption. Brothers Luis and Roger Albino, Brush Street Park, 1951. She stared at the photograph long enough that her daughters glanced at each other, unsure whether to speak. She didn't. Something in her expression told them this moment wasn't meant to be interrupted. She zoomed in. The boy in the picture, Luis at age 6, had familiar eyes. She had seen those same eyes earlier that year on her computer screen, in the profile photo of a man her DNA test claimed was close family. Her breath tightened. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and brought up the test results. The older man's face filled the screen. A soft half-smile, weathered skin, a long life behind his eyes. She held the phone beside the microfilm screen. Side by side. Even with the decades between the images, the resemblance was impossible to ignore. The shape of the eyebrows, the tilt of the nose, the way the corners of the mouth lifted. She felt the room fading around her. The air, the light, the faint hum of the microfilm machine, all softened into nothing except the quiet realization forming inside her. Her mother had been right. Her grandmother had been right. And every story whispered across the family table was no myth. She printed the photo, then printed it again, as if the act made it more real. Her daughters helped her collect the pages, sliding them carefully into a folder. They drove straight to her house. Alida laid everything out on the dining table: microfilm prints, the DNA screenshot, a timeline she scribbled onto scratch paper as she pieced the fragments together. She pulled out a pen and circled both faces. The same man. Her pulse kept rushing, steady and insistent. She knew what she had to do next. The next morning, she walked through the doors of the Oakland Police Department for the first time in her life. There was a weight to it. Not fear, not pressure, but the sense that she was stepping into a place her grandmother had visited hundreds of times before her. The front desk officer greeted her politely. "I need to speak to someone about a cold case," she said, her voice steady. "Which case?" the officer asked. "The disappearance of a 6-year-old boy," she replied. "His name was Luis Albino." The officer blinked. Slowly, as if the name reached into a part of the department's memory that hadn't been touched in years. He excused himself, disappeared behind a door, and returned with 2 detectives. They listened as she explained the DNA match, the photo in the archives, the profile of the man in his 70s. One of the detectives asked to see everything. She handed him the folder. His partner leaned over his shoulder, scanning the contents with a growing stillness. "How long ago did you get this match?" one asked. "For years," Alida said quietly. "At first, I wasn't sure what to do with it." The detective nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on the photographs. He lifted one of the microfilm prints, Luis and Roger in the sandbox, and set it beside the DNA screenshot. He didn't speak for several seconds. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed. "We're opening the file," he said. "Today." They escorted her down a hallway. The building was modernized in some places, worn in others. They led her into a small room, the kind used for interviews and long conversations that never fit neatly into reports. The door closed behind them with a soft click. One detective took a seat. The other remained standing. The seated detective set the folder on the table, folded his hands, and looked directly at her. "Alida," he said quietly, "we need to talk about the man you matched with. The truth behind that match, and what it means for the entire case, is about to reshape everything. He wants to meet his family." The folder sat unopened on the detective's desk, its edges softened by time. For a long moment, no one spoke. Alida sat across from him, her purse still hanging off her elbow, her breath unsteady. The detective reached for the file with cautious hands, almost as if disturbing it too quickly might break whatever fragile truth had finally surfaced after 73 years. "Your DNA match," he began, "is old enough to be Luis." He didn't rush. Each word was measured, weighed. "But the only way to know is through a controlled test." Alida nodded. It was all she could do. The next days unfolded with a quiet intensity. Federal names began entering the conversation. First the California DOJ, then the FBI's Missing Persons Division. Calls were exchanged behind closed doors. Emails sent. Background checks initiated. The case, untouched for generations, was suddenly moving again. The man, the one from her DNA results, the one who had ignored her message for years earlier, lived on the East Coast. He had a different name, a different past, a different family. When agents reached him, he didn't believe them at first. They expected that. Most people, when told they might have been abducted 7 decades ago, didn't know how to react. Still, he agreed to speak. The call between him and the agents took place somewhere far away from Oakland, in a quiet office overlooking a city he believed he'd grown up in since childhood. His voice, according to the report later shared with Alida, carried a careful steadiness. The kind of steadiness a person develops by building a life on unexamined ground. When they asked if he would consent to a formal DNA sample, there was a pause long enough that the transcript marked it. He eventually said yes. A kit was mailed. Instructions followed. Then the waiting began. Weeks stretched thin. Alida checked her email more often than she wanted to admit. Some mornings she woke before sunrise with the strange sensation that something had shifted, even though nothing had. She placed the DNA screenshot from 2020 in a drawer, then took it out again the next day, unable to forget the age of the man attached to it. Across town, the rest of the family stayed on edge but tried not to show it. They had lived too long in disappointment to let hope grow quickly. The past had taught them caution. Roger, now in his 80s, sat in his living room with the curtains partially drawn. A single framed photo rested on his lap. A picture of two little boys sitting in the sun, Luis leaning into him with a playful tug on his sleeve. Roger traced the faces with his thumb the way one might touch a fragile relic. He was right here, he whispered to the empty room. Right here. He didn't tell the rest of the family how much he thought about that day in the park. He didn't explain the nights. He still woke up hearing his mother's voice calling Luis's name through the wind. Instead, he waited, quietly, carefully. It was a Thursday afternoon when things finally moved. Alida was chopping vegetables in her kitchen when her phone began to vibrate on the counter. The screen lit up with a number she didn't recognize. Her hands froze mid-motion. Something inside her told her to answer before the second ring. "This is Agent Wallace with the FBI," the voice said. Her heart dropped into her stomach. "We have your results." The words came slowly, as if the agent understood the weight they carried. "There is a match," he said. Not tentative, not uncertain. A match. Alida pressed a hand to her chest, the world narrowing to a single point. "It is conclusive," the agent continued. "The man you match with is genetically linked to your family. He is Luis." She sank into a chair without realizing she'd moved. Her eyes blurred. Her breath shook. For a moment, she felt like she was living inside a story someone else had written, one she had no right to alter, yet somehow had. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words barely reached her own ears. The next call went to the Albino family group chat. Phones lit up in different corners of the city. Replies came almost instantly. Someone cried. Someone prayed. Someone couldn't speak at all. Then came the call to Roger. He listened in silence, one hand gripping the arm of his chair, the other still holding the childhood photo. His lower lip trembled, but he steadied it. When the agent finished speaking, Roger exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he'd carried for 73 years. "My brother," he murmured. "My little brother." No one spoke after that. They didn't need to. 2 days later, Oakland PD asked everyone to gather for a briefing. The family sat together at a long wooden table, the same room where decades-old case photos were pinned against a board like ghosts waiting for release. A detective stepped forward, hands clasped. "There's one more thing," he said. The room stilled. "He has agreed to meet you." A beat passed. No one breathed. The detective continued, his voice steady but warm. "He wants to meet his family." The room erupts in shock, but Roger stays seated, gripping the photo. His hands shake, not from fear, but from something he hasn't felt in a lifetime. Hope. June 2024 arrived with a thin layer of morning fog resting over the Oakland airport. Travelers moved past one another in steady lines, rolling bags, checking screens, unaware that a reunion 73 years overdue was seconds from unfolding on the other side of the arrival's gate. Luis stepped out first. His back was straight, his shoulders firm, but his eyes told another story. They scanned the waiting faces slowly, as if searching for something familiar in a sea of strangers. The overhead speakers echoed flight numbers, muffled and forgettable, but he didn't hear any of it. He kept walking until he noticed a woman near the railing holding nothing but her own breath. Alida. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She simply stepped forward. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her daughters stood behind her, watching the man whose name they had heard whispered through their family history for years. Luis exhaled, unsure if he should smile or brace himself, but when Alida reached him, she wrapped her arms around him with a gentleness that steadied them both. The hug lasted longer than either expected. No dramatic tears, no crowd turning to stare. Just two pieces of a fractured story touching for the first time. When they finally stepped back, Luis looked at her as if trying to reconcile decades of missing pages with the person standing in front of him. "You look like my mother," he said quietly. Alida swallowed hard and nodded. "She waited for you." They left the airport together, walking slowly through the sliding doors and into the muted June air. The drive toward Roger's home was silent at first. Luis kept his hands folded, eyes moving between the window and the road ahead. He didn't ask what Roger looked like now. He didn't need to. Some part of him carried the image of a boy calling his name from the swings, a voice he had long forgotten consciously, but still lived somewhere in memory. They pulled into a modest neighborhood tucked behind a row of aging maples. Roger's house sat near the middle of the block, porch light glowing even in daylight, as if someone had turned it on hours earlier and forgotten to switch it off. Inside, Roger waited near the door, leaning slightly on the frame. His breath caught when he heard footsteps approaching. When Luis stepped in, everything in the room seemed to still. The clock ticking on the wall, the shifting shadows, even the air. The two men stood inches apart. Older now, worn by different battles, shaped by different homes. Yet something in their faces aligned. The same arch of the brow, the same set of the jaw. Roger's voice cracked first. "Luis." The answer came without hesitation. "It's me." And then they met in the middle of the doorway, arms closing around each other with the force of years spent wondering. Roger held on tightly, his chin trembling against his brother's shoulder. Luis breathed in sharply, overwhelmed by a warmth he didn't remember but recognized instantly. They moved to the living room, speaking in low voices. Stories spilled out, small ones, large ones, gaps filled, questions answered. At times they laughed unexpectedly, the sound echoing like something rediscovered. Other moments were heavier, spoken in fragments, as if neither wanted to set down too much of the past at once. Night settled around them. Lights dimmed. Still they sat together, refusing to let the moment slip too soon. For the first time in 73 years, the brothers fell quiet at the same time. Comfortable silence, not searching silence. 2 months later, the family gathered again. This time in a hospital room washed in pale light. Machines hummed softly. Roger lay in bed, eyes tired but aware. Luis sat beside him, holding his hand with the same steady grip from their reunion. Roger whispered something only Luis could hear. Luis leaned forward, nodding, eyes lowered. Then the monitors eased into a quieter rhythm. If that moment broke you, leave a candle emoji in the comments. And subscribe, their story isn't finished yet. Luis remained seated, hands still wrapped around his brother's, as a single question formed in his expression. How do you say goodbye to someone you found only moments before losing again? The cemetery is quiet when Luis arrives. Morning light settles over the headstones, soft and pale, touching the grass in gentle strokes. He takes his time approaching the grave, moving with the careful steps of a man carrying more memories than strength. The stone with his mother's name looks older than he imagined, edges worn from years of weather and waiting. For a while, he stands without speaking, just breathing, just feeling the weight of everything she carried for him. When he finally kneels, his hand trembles as it touches the cool surface of the stone. "I made it home," he whispers. The words leave him in a low exhale, almost as if he's afraid the moment will slip away if he gives it too much sound. "Mama, I made it home." A breeze moves through the trees, rustling leaves the way his mother used to stir the curtains on warm days. Luis closes his eyes. In that small shift of wind, the years fold in on themselves. A child taken, a mother searching, a family suspended in a question that refused to fade. Behind him, his family waits by the path, giving him time. Alida stands with her daughters, hands linked. She watches him with the quiet certainty of someone who knows she didn't just solve a case. She completed a circle. Later that afternoon, at the Oakland Police Department, a detective returns the Albino file to its shelf. The binder looks thin compared to the decades it represents. Inside are the yellowed reports, the old newspaper clippings, and a few recent pages documenting the DNA match that rewrote history. The kidnapper's name is still missing. No arrest. No closure in the legal sense. Only evidence of a woman who vanished as quickly as she appeared. Before sliding the file in place, the detective presses a new sticky note to the front. Pending, kidnapper unknown. He stares at it for a moment, then turns off the light. The room falls into stillness, the file left alone in the dimness, waiting for whatever truth might rise years from now. Some chapters find an ending, others wait. But the heart of this story, a boy lost, a family searching, a reunion no one thought possible, has finally stepped into the light. Because hope outlives time. Because DNA remembers what humans forget. Because some stories, no matter how long they drift, find their way home. If this story moved you, don't leave quietly. Hit subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and join us as we continue uncovering the cases that remind us why every missing voice deserves to be heard.